Hi, Peter Charles here of Hooked for Life Fly Fishing. And if you saw my last video, I talked about trying to come up with a method that would allow us to recreate that up and down motion that we get with mayflies. Is they fill their bodies with gas, they float to the surface, and then they try to swim back down, then they go back to the surface, then they swim back down. They're very vulnerable to fish in this stage. You'll know this by when you're fishing a wet fly dead drifting, or you're dead drifting a nymph, and as soon as it moves, the fish hits it. Or you'll see these flashes from fish, but they're not near the surface. They're down a few inches or even a few feet. You see a flash, you know the fish is not at the bottom, you know the fish is not at the top. What's happening? Well, they're hitting those nymphs on their way up and down. Very vulnerable, very easy for a fish to pick off. A lot of the nymphs, some of the nymphs swim quite quickly and some of them don't. And the ones that don't swim quickly, usually the crawlers and the clingers, they will definitely get hit easily. So that's what's going on. We're going to create a leader to how to deal with that. If you saw my previous video, you saw my crude representation. Now we're looking at the real thing. So what do we need to do this? Well, one of the best ways to start off with is one of our dry fly leaders. 3x, 4x is good, maybe 5x. I wouldn't go any skinnier than that. And I have an old leader here. And of course, here's the butt section and my perfection loop. And if I keep running my hands along, eventually all of a sudden it starts to thin down. So it goes down to the tippet. So where I'm holding it here is where the tippet actually starts. And if you've been using a dry fly leader for any length of time, what happens is you get nibbles back, you tie on more tippet, nibbles back, tie on more tippet. You get to the point where you're almost tying your tippet to the taper. And that's the kind of leader we want to use for this one. So in other words, use one of your old dry fly leaders that you've beaten up multiple times, and you've nibbled it back to the start of the taper. And that's what we want. And what we're going to do is we're going to take fluorocarbon and attach the fluorocarbon to here. Now, I'm going to be looking at 6x or 5x, and this could be a 3x or a 2x leader. Stouter leaders work better. You might have problems putting a knot in here that's reliable. So one of the things you can use is a tippet ring. So you would tie a tippet ring onto the end of this. But before we do that, we want to put in a little float. Well, I've got two different floats here. One I will use and one I won't. It's this little oval thing. It's a little inline float. And let's see if I can do this without my glasses. The end of my line is kinked. There we go. So I put my float on and it's inline, as you can see. You do not want to use something like this float, which works like that. So it's above the line. Because when you've got that kind of float, I'll hold it down here, you can see it. It sits up above the mono. And that's going to create all sorts of turbulence and wobbling, and it's going to cast ugly. You don't want that. So this is a thingamabobber. It's useful for other kinds of nymphing, but don't use it for this purpose. Use a little inline float like this. This is a little foam thing. Don't ask me where I got it from. It's about 30 years old. You could also use strike putty. That would work just fine. You want something slim and small because we're not supporting this thing at the surface necessarily. We just want to create a drop. So our leader goes straight and drops, and that's the purpose of the little float. If it's under the water an inch or two, that's even better because you're not creating a surface wake with that then. And it's less likely to disturb fish. So we have our little float, we have our tippet ring we put at the end, and then we attach our fluorocarbon. And the length of the fluorocarbon is going to depend on a number of factors. It's going to depend on how deep the water is and how slow the water is. So the deep, fast run will take a longer tippet than a slow, shallow run. So, and of course, somewhere in between the other scenarios. But I'm not going to give you a hard and fast formula. It could be anywhere from 2 feet to 4 feet. But you're going to have something on the end, and fluorocarbon to allow this thing to sink. So that's what we've got there. We've got the little float, we've got a tippet ring, and then we've got our fluorocarbon. And if you're using something like that little float, these are bobber stoppers that you get in conventional fishing. If you're going to use something that can move, put bobber stopper on either side of it. And where is it? Here we go. I've got these little foam spools that I keep my leaders on, and I'll just pull this one off. And there is the rig. You can see the tippet ring, you can see the little foam, and you can see the two bobber stoppers. And that, you know, keeps this whole thing together. And then this is just a regular dry fly leader that I have adjusted for it. And I've cut a little bit of the back end off to keep the leader length reasonable. I don't need all the length. It's not doing the same job as a dry fly leader where you want that beautiful transfer of energy and a nice turnover. Who cares? You just want it to lay out. And so you can have a shorter butt section if you want. The purpose of the butt section is to keep it close to the surface of the water. You don't want the butt section of the leader sinking. You want it at the surface. And so, and then you add the float at the end, which keeps this up and enables you to get that droop going. So your fly is down here. So that's basically the leader setup. It's pretty simple. Just to recap, we've got a dry fly leader that we have cut the tippet off. We put a little inline float at the end, and then we can put, say, a tippet ring if we wanted to, and then we put our fluorocarbon in to that and tie our nymph on the end. And the purpose of this is, as I say, is to create that angle. So when you strip, the fly comes up, and when you stop stripping, the fly drops. Just keeps going like that. So that's the leader. And in the next video, we'll talk about flies, and then we'll get on and see if we can actually get out in the water and catch a fish with this method. So stay tuned.